Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks to Venable for putting this on. As everyone's been saying, it's our first time doing this forum since 2019. It is an annual highlight for FIDO Alliance, and we're really honored to be able to co-sponsor this alongside Identity Theft Resource Center and Better Identity Coalition, and to engage with so many of you here today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today, in a moment, about what FIDO Alliance is up to and how our work plugs into the broader identity ecosystem. I think it's been a real interesting flow of conversations so far today, and hopefully you'll see how FIDO fits into this, starting with user authentication, but also touching on some of the other work we're doing around identity at large. First, though, I want to look back to, let's do this. Last year, this is our virtual summit, so we did this virtually, and I'm going to take a victory lap on some predictions that we made. The first prediction we made, brace yourself, is that phishing attacks will continue to succeed. Not listed here was the prediction that the sun is going to set in the west each year. But now, so we actually called that out simply because it's worth highlighting. Of course, phishing is going to succeed because it's too easy, it's too cheap, right? So if I'm a hacker sitting behind a keyboard somewhere in Eastern Europe, if I could buy a professional phishing toolkit for a couple $100 with professional support, buy a couple million names of credential pairs and try to stuff them or try to phish people and have it 2 to 3% success rate, yes, I'll keep on phishing. So as long as there are not controls to stop phishing, attacks will continue to succeed. But the other area we highlighted, which was a little bit more forward thinking, was that MFA bypass attacks will become mainstream. All right, so a lot of people, if you back up a year, was like, okay, I have SMS OTP, I have 2FA in place, yeah, I'm all good. The fact of the matter is, no, you're not all good. Right, and we saw a number of high-profile MFA bypass attacks happening throughout 2022, and it's going to be ongoing here in 2023. So, and I think the key thing when you look at that is a need to delineate between what I'll call legacy multi-factor authentication, and modern possession-based unphishable multi-factor authentication. And in fact, this is something we've been preaching on for a while now. Right, we need to have a fundamental shift in the way that people authenticate from something that's inherently knowledge-based, so something that sits on a server, that sits in your head, that you enter and transmit over a network, to something that's more inherently possession-based, so something that you hold, something that you authenticate to locally, where it's it's not on a server, it's all local authentication, which makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to execute remote attacks. So really, our definition of unphishable multi-factor authentication is that it must be user-initiated and cryptographically secure. Right? Again, no human-readable secrets being transmitted over a network creates no window for a hacker to step in between. So let's look at where we stand today. Or I guess over the past few quarters, here are some of the trends and headlines that we're seeing. All of these have identity implications, whether it's more focused on age verification, or increased fraud, or SMS bypass attacks, or digital wallets and MDLs. We had lots of discussions on those today. All of these are important trends, and all of them are also germane to the work that we're doing at FIDO Alliance, which is actually a good opportunity for me to go back on the prediction thing and give you some predictions for the year ahead. So a couple of things to highlight. First, back to the MFA bypass attack theme. That will continue to happen this year. Right? That's going to happen at scale. The silver lining here is that we'll see it actually accelerate adoption of unphishable authentication. And we saw this last year already, right, with the Octopus attacks that happened. Right? When Octopus hit, several dozen companies, there was one standout exception, which was Cloudflare. Right? Cloudflare is layering FIDO security keys on top of Okta instead of TOTP. They did not get hit by this attack. Twilio conversely did, but to their credit, Twilio was very open about their experience and what they did and what their solution was, which quite simply was to move to FIDO2 rather than using OTP on top of Okta. Right, so I think we'll see other organizations follow suit when they read about or experience, even worse, an MFA bypass attack in their enterprise. As we look at consumers, and someone talked about this earlier today, I think in the ITRC readout, SMS is a major channel now for account takeovers. And there's something different, to the average consumer about getting a text message and a phishing email, right? Most people are savvy enough to sniff out a phishing email, but SMS is much more personal. It's a space in your phone that you're accustomed to only hearing from friends and family. And so when you get a message there, it's something you take to heart and you take action on. But the fact of the matter is people are getting burned on this today, and they will continue to get burned in a pretty broad sense this year. So I think there will be one or two major headline earning SMS bypass attacks that will cause consumers to finally question how much they should trust SMS OTP for 2FA. And so I think, again, there's a silver lining there, which is that more and more consumers will start demanding better solutions. And service providers will move from check the box 2FA using SMS OTP to something that truly is unfishable and better protects their consumers and themselves. And the third prediction here is that identity verification will hit the mainstream, right? So it's already mainstream in this room. We've talked about it all morning. But Elon Musk brought this up to the common vernacular when he talked about Twitter Blue back in November, December, right? Or maybe you read about the requirement for age verification to view pornography in Louisiana and elsewhere. So I think the good news here is that, again, consumers, the average person on the street will start to understand what identity verification means and actually start to understand what digital identity means. And that's a net benefit, because the more people understand about what their identity means and the importance of it, the more steps they'll take to actually protect it and maybe make savvier decisions as they work to protect themselves. But I should note there, it should not be incumbent upon the citizen or the user to protect themselves. I strongly feel it's incumbent on the service provider to put tools in place to protect their customers. So let's pivot to look at what's ahead for FIDO Alliance in 2023. Before I get into what we're doing in user authentication, I wanted to highlight some other work we're doing in identity. So Stephanie talked on this a little bit in the last panel. Remote identity verification. We've been working on creating some standards and performance criteria around identity verification and binding for a couple of years now. And frankly, it's taken longer than we'd hoped, but it's also a really big challenge. It's a pretty audacious thing we're trying to do here. And the good news is we're making good progress, right? The market demand is that as the need for strong identity verification has grown, so has the number of solutions in the marketplace. We've heard from some vendors today, and implementers need a way to assess them. So the first thing we've released is the document authenticity certification program. This allows vendors to demonstrate how well they're actually doing authenticating government issued documents. All right. So is it a true document? How well are they reading it? This is part of our performance criteria. The next step on this front is adding face verification certification for liveness and selfie match. And at that point, then, which we anticipate releasing this year, we'll be able to do the full certification for remote identity verification vendors and processes. So that's important work. Biometric performance criteria. So we've had a biometric certification program in market for a couple of years now. We've certified dozens of products. This sits completely adjacent to what we're doing in user authentication. This was in response to industry demand for like a industry grade biometric certification program. And what we assess is literally the performance of different biometric components. But what we are now introducing to market based on market feedback is greater focus on PADs, so presentation account detection, presentation attack detection, rather than false accept rate, rather than FAR. We're doing this in response to market demand. We're doing this because we feel like that's where the real threat is for the vast majority of use cases, and also because FAR testing is complex and expensive, right? So it's not for everybody. Now, we still offer that as part of our program, but this PAD-only approach, we think, will open up and encourage more people to go through biometric performance certification testing. So let's come back to our bread and butter, right? When you think of FIDO Alliance, you think about getting rid of passwords, you think about user authentication, and that's what we've made great progress on over the years. But the core question we're asking ourselves inside of FIDO Alliance is, how do we scale deployment of FIDO authentication? How do we get this to be as widespread, used as frequently as passwords? Right, that's the goal, is to replace passwords. And speaking of audacious, that's a crazy audacious goal, right? And you think about what do we need to get there? And I think there's two things it comes down to, right, at a very high level. One is ubiquity, right? If you think about passwords, you can use a password anywhere. And people know how to use passwords too. So there's already an incumbency effect there as well. You can enter a password on any device. It's no fun to do it on a smart TV, but you can do. You know where to look for passwords when you go to a new website. So there's a learned behavior. So we need to take on that ubiquity and incumbents. And the good news there is that FIDO is now supported in every major operating system, every major browser, virtually every modern device, and not so modern devices all support FIDO authentication. So the endpoints have been largely addressed. But then you come to usability, right? And we've done a lot of usability testing, and we understand the need to both, from a usability standpoint, to educate consumers, but also make sure that the authentication flows are intuitive and ready to use. Because there's a long legacy of MFA technologies that were too complex and simply won't be used, right? So if your MFA is too hard to use, your employees will work around it. Your consumers will not opt in. So usability is of great concern. So when we look at this, the good news is that FIDO Alliance as a body is making sizable investments in UX, right? We uniquely have a user experience working group inside of FIDO Alliance that's comprised of designers and UX leads from some of the biggest brands on the planet. Like, this is incredibly unique in the standards sphere, right? And this group is doing amazing work, and they're issuing things like UX guidelines for how to deploy FIDO most effectively based on extensive testing and data-driven guidance. But beyond guidelines, beyond just the best way to use FIDO, we realized that there's some fundamental aspects in how we've been deploying FIDO that was hindering such adoption. So we took a decision with Passkey that allows for us to further usability from the OS on up while not losing focus on security. So there's going to be a panel after me talking about Passkey in more depth, but I want to talk about it a little bit today. Fundamentally, what we're doing with Passkey, which is different from the way FIDO is deployed originally, was we allow the private key now in the FIDO key pair to be securely synced across a cloud, say an operating system cloud. What this does is provide a better user experience for the consumer, right? So consumers are getting accustomed to an experience, say if you're using things like iCloud Keychain, that you expect your passwords and all those features to be on any Apple device that you're using. If you're using a password manager, you expect to be able to just access that on any device and not have to re-enroll each time you're on a new device for the same service that you've already logged into. In addition to that, Passkey is more deeply integrated into the operating systems themselves, right? So some of the awkwardness that you'll see from some of the initial WebAuthn implementations, where you get some kind of quirky device prompts and browser prompts, that starts to go away with this deeper integration of Passkey into the operating systems. And it's important to note that part of our announcement back in May, we made a multi-party announcement with FIDO Alliance, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, where all three operating system vendors and platform vendors all committed to support Passkey in their flagship operating systems. Today, this is live across Apple operating systems and Google operating environments as well, with Windows on the way. So I think that, one benefit here, another benefit of Passkey is that we're also, using the term Passkey to talk about any passwordless FIDO authenticator. So we go back to the user education, user recognition thing that needs to happen as well. There's never been a term for FIDO, right? For those of us in the room and you're deploying in your enterprise and your agency, we know FIDO, but the average person on the street certainly does not. And so we want people to start looking for a common user flow, a common user experience, common terminology when they're doing something other than password-based sign-ins. So it's little surprise, and we're very pleased to see this going mainstream already, right? Just this year, there is this great article in Wirecutter, a corresponding one in the consumer tech section of the Washington Post, talking about passkeys. I'm getting questions from my mom on passkeys, which is fantastic because she finally understands what I do for a living. But one of our predictions is that passkey will become a hot or even hotter topic in 2023 than it was in 2022. So why are we doing this again? Just to recap, and again, you'll hear more about this, but two key points, right? FIDO's mission as a body, FIDO Alliance's mission is to reduce the industry reliance on passwords. Simply put, passkeys stand to take passwords out of play for the vast majority of consumer use cases. That is a very good thing and 100% in line with our mission. But also important to note that this vision of kind of OS sync passkeys is highly complementary to FIDO security keys. In fact, for more secure or more regulated use cases, you can have what we'll call device-bound passkey on a FIDO security key. So these things are all highly complementary and focused on user experience and focused on unphishable user authentication. Another aspect of this, comes to usability, and there's been great discussion today about the digital divide. And I think this is something really important. We've talked about the digital divide and identity proofing and in tools and things like that. But one way I look at this is that digital transformation has been wonderful in a lot of ways, but it's also left parts of society behind. And one thing digital transformation has also done is propagated a ton of new accounts, right? You need an account for everything now. And with every account, you also need a password for everything. And so again, people who are less digital savvy find this to be more of a challenge. And systems and services they used to be able to call about or go to a bricks and mortar shop about, they now need an account. They now need a password. And I think that's also propagating the digital divide. So it's important that we try to take steps as an industry to make it easier for people to actually continue to access services that they might not have done digitally before, but that they are forced to do so now. And our feeling is that by minimizing the stress of having to establish, remember, and enter passwords, we're actually going to help bridge the digital divide. And passwords are very much a wedge broadening the digital divide. So we see passkey in this approach to helping solve this problem as well. At a higher level, it's important to think about the broader security spectrum and where all of FIDO's approaches fit in. From left to right, of course, you have the legacy phishable authentication with passwords and OTP. And then with FIDO, everything's unphishable, right? It's all using asymmetric public key cryptography. And you see passkeys as announced, or it's unphishable authentication. But again, for more secure intensive use cases, you can have device-bound passkeys on things like FIDO security keys, or even on platform authenticators. But the key thing to understand is that no matter what your use case is, there's a way that FIDO's specifications can be brought to bear against that to provide unphishable user authentication. As we pivot to government and talk a little bit about FIDO's fit for government, I think the FIDO imperative here is similar to that of industry in several ways, in the sense that you want to protect online accounts, for citizens and employees. You want to have better sign-in experiences, but also, trust is an important concept, especially in the government ecosystem. If I don't trust the U.S. government to take care of my information, I probably won't go to login.gov to access my services, right? Likewise, in the B2B side of things, agency side of things, that trust is absolutely important. But one prediction we're making this year also is that we'll see meaningful progress on reducing reliance on passwords in government settings. And we're seeing a lot of that happen already, and we'll talk about that in just a second here. Something we've been saying for years, and Jeremy's been doing this, thank you, Jeremy, predating 863-3, is that when you present FIDO to government officials, whether it's someone like Congressman Foster or other people on the Hill, FIDO brings a new paradigm for user authentication, right? People are accustomed to passwords. FIDO brings user-friendly public key cryptography, which is a new way of thinking about authentication. And so a key takeaway here, and something we've been preaching, is that as technology evolves, policy needs to evolve with it. And FIDO very much is an evolution of user authentication. And the good news is that we're seeing progress. And one such example of this is OMB. All right, so government now recognizes the difference between legacy MFA and phishing-resistant MFA. And so one of the headline activities for FIDO Alliance and our broader community has been the zero trust strategy from the Biden administration, which is mandating usage of unphishable multi-factor authentication. So it's mandated inside of agencies, and it's mandated to be available for consumers. Additionally, this calls out the option for agencies to use FIDO security keys rather than PIV and CAC. And look, PIV and CAC are great, but there's a lot of deployment and deployability benefits that FIDO security keys bring to the table. Some other great adoption we've seen and great endorsements from the government. CISA have called FIDO security keys the gold standard of multi-factor authentication. If any of you attended Authenticate or viewed it online, you saw Director Easterly give a great keynote, and she actually did a FIDO dance in the video as part of her keynote. So we're very blessed and fortunate to have this sort of endorsement from CISA, symbolizing how the strong support from the U.S. government for FIDO authentication. NIST, there was a great workshop here yesterday. Many thanks to NIST. I saw Ryan around here somewhere. Ryan and David and team for making time to actually engage with members of FIDO Alliance, Better Identity Coalition, and Kantara. we're excited about the updated digital identity guidelines. 863B calls out the concept of passkey, and we're hoping that this lands as AAL2, as they are indeed unphishable cryptographic authentication mechanisms. It's not just in the US, right? So we're seeing worldwide adoption of FIDO for government services. I think governments far and wide appreciate the fact that there's an open standard where the entire industry is working behind to give them a standards-based way to do strong user authentication for their e-citizen services and also various e-government services. If you Google or if you Bing FIDO government deployments and recognitions, it'll bring you to this webpage where you can learn more about how each of these governments is using FIDO authentication in a variety of settings. And market adoption is happening as well, right? Where government deploys and regulated industry follows or accelerates their implementations. This is a very short list of companies that are deploying FIDO at scale. Our goal, of course, is to see greater breadth and depth from companies like this and the next couple thousand behind them. But again, we're seeing good early adoption and want to see even more using passkey, reaching every consumer application on the planet. So to wrap up here, I brought in some predictions. I kind of want to re-summarize those, and we may have time for a question or two, or I'll turn things over to the passkey panel. So this year, not listed here is that phishing attacks will continue, because they will continue. That's too low-hanging fruit. But again, MFA bypass attacks will happen again. There will be some high-profile MFA bypass attacks, but the good news is this will accelerate adoption of unphishable user authentication. Secondly, smishing. This is going to be a consumer issue this year at scale. There will be ramifications, good and bad, but it will change consumer perception of what strong authentication really is, and will push more service providers to deploy better two-factor authentication. Identity verification will leave this room in discussion and reach the mainstream, which is a good thing. Passkeys will become a hotter topic. And last but not least, we've been on this mission for a while, and I often get the question, when are we getting rid of passwords? And my kind of canned response, which is a true response, is that, hey, this is a journey, not a sprint. But I think that journey is getting shorter and shorter each year, right? And I think passkeys are going to accelerate that journey. So we're going to see, reduced reliance on passwords in government settings, but also in beyond in private industry in all corners of the world. So thank you so much. Jeremy, how are we doing on timing? Do I have time for one? Yeah. I'm happy to take a question or two. I see one question from Kalia.
I was sent a video in the last week with a giant FIDO conspiracy saying, like, because CISA approved it, it must be, and Apple and Google and Microsoft are engaged. This must be a giant conspiracy, like access, like get all the clouds to the keys so that the NSA can access everything. And I'm not asking you to respond to that conspiracy, but I'm just naming it as our industry, like the meta industry, has a conspiracy theory problem. And I'm curious what you, and I'll sort of throw this out to other leaders in the room, what we are doing to address this collectively.
Yeah, so first of all, interesting conspiracy theory, and there are those out there, and I'd say we have a global problem around conspiracies. And I'm actually glad you raised this point, because one thing about passkey, and we'll talk about it in the next panel, is that passkey was never envisioned to be something, the remit only of Apple, Google, and Microsoft. In fact, I would argue that for passkey to be successful, it needs to be supported by third-party providers. That will create competition. Competition creates trust, but we need to be careful in the way that we enable, say, someone to have a sync fabric that syncs, critical private key credentials, and that's something that FIDO Alliance is working on. How to dispel conspiracy theories is a broader topic that's probably above my pay grade. But what we can do as an alliance, what we can do as an identity industry is put information out there, right, on how this stuff works. One thing we're going to be doing around passkey is, we're not a consumer-facing organization, but we will be creating consumer-ready assets on how this stuff works. And I think, Kalia, that's a good point. We'll want to, put information in there about, like, no, this does not mean that you're ceding all your sign-in rights to the big three. That you have options, either now or in the future, to use third-party independent credential providers to manage your passkeys as well. Okay. Thank you. So the next, I guess the panel should come on stage.